Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, today something a little different, a bit of a departure from my daily legal analysis videos here at Justice Matters. I recently had an opportunity to sit down and interview a gentleman named Bob Westbrooks. Who is Bob Westbrooks? You're about to find out. He is a somewhat quiet, reserved, behind the scenes, extraordinary public servant. And Bob authored a book. Here it is. It's titled Left Holding the Bag. Bob Westbrooks, as you can see there, is the former Inspector General and Pandemic Watchdog. And Left Holding the Bag is a watchdog's account of how Washington fumbled its COVID test. And if we turn to the back of the book, there's a quote from President Biden. Quote, "The American people deserve to know that their tax dollars are being spent as intended. My message to those cheats out there is this: you can't hide. We're going to find you. We're going to make you pay back what you stole and hold you accountable under the law." And Bob Westbrooks, as the Inspector General, as the watchdog over how pandemic relief money was being spent, was in a very real sense taking point on trying to root out crime, corruption, fraud, waste, and abuse, trying to hold accountable those people who would take advantage of a national pandemic, indeed a worldwide pandemic, and use it as an opportunity to steal from the American taxpayers. That's who Bob Westbrooks is. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Bob Westbrooks, and I know I certainly appreciate his efforts to be a watchdog over how our tax dollars are spent. I am thrilled to have the opportunity today to talk with, to interview Bob Westbrooks, a former IG Inspector General extraordinaire. We're going to talk about the importance of the mission of inspectors general in our federal government. Bob, first of all, welcome to Justice Matters. As the people who typically tune into my YouTube channel know, I don't do a lot of interviews, once in a blue moon. But I read your book. I've gotten to know you. We've talked. We've met. You were good enough to attend our annual Team Justice gathering a few months back. And I'm really excited about getting to talk to you about your experience as an Inspector General during one of the most challenging times I think our nation has faced on the health front in recent decades. So thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you so much.
What I'd like to start with is give the folks a little bit of an idea of your background. So just your educational experience, your work experience, particularly as an Inspector General, that kind of brought you to the moment where you were appointed as the watchdog over pandemic response.
So some watchdog inspector generals are appointed. They're appointed by the president and may not come from government. They might be corporate lawyers or former federal prosecutors. I was one that was a career watchdog. Although I was a lawyer by training and practiced law for a couple of years before I became a Fed, I really wanted to be a Fed. I liked working cases. I like working investigations. That's like where the fun is. So I became a U.S. Postal Inspector, which is the best job in federal government, because at the time, you were a law enforcement officer, just like the FBI or DEA, and you were also the internal watchdog for the Postal Service, which is one of the largest civilian agencies we have that touches everybody's life. So when you actually find a window clerk that's embezzling or a letter carrier that's stealing from their route, you're not just looking at an arrest, but you're looking at the internal control failure that caused that to happen and allowed that to happen, particularly if it's a case that's gone on for a long period of time, and you try to fix it. So I cut my teeth as a postal inspector, and I realized if you want to be a fraud guy, you really need to speak finance. So I went back and got my CPA, worked my way up and around the IG community, got a few other certifications in the process, and ultimately wound up at the Small Business Administration. I was the deputy IG there before I was appointed IG at a small government corporation called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. And while I was in that job, I was pretty active in the Council of IGs, which is the committee of all of the 75 federal IGs. I like to joke when the pandemic hit and the IG community needed to appoint somebody into this role. Looking back at the time, I was incredibly flattered to be asked to take on this massive role because it was at the time where IGs were being fired. And it was only a couple of months later that it dawned on me that I was the only person gullible enough really to take the job, because there was not a lot of people in retrospect raising their hands, because it was a very tumultuous time. Never in our history have, in a 40-year history of IGs, have IGs been fired by the president. They can be fired by the president. It's certainly a presidential prerogative, but just customs and norms, it was never done before. And it was,
and I
it
think,
was only
correct me
done.
if I'm wrong, do I recall in your book you said like in the last 40 years there's been exactly one IG fired?
There was one. It was fired by President Obama, and he was fired. He was at a small agency that had a board, and with Republican and Democrat members of the board, a chair and a vice chair, and they both actually went to the White House and said, for personal reasons that we believe that were valid at the time, that we believe that this IG is no longer fit to serve. So it was bipartisan, and yeah, that was the only time it's happened. And then in a matter of a few weeks, we saw, more than a handful of IGs let go, and let go prominently and for nefarious reasons. It wasn't, a bipartisan support. It was on the record. This is the reason why this watchdog needs to go. So that was the environment that I was appointed into.
And when you say prominently, I'm not trying to be snarky here, but were any of them fired via tweet?
I don't, it could very well be, because that was the way that the former president did business. So oftentimes, I don't know their personal story, but I do know it was very abrupt, to the point of come up to the secretary's office and, here's a box, get your stuff out of the building. And that's no way to treat a civil servant who's done absolutely nothing wrong. And in fact, the one that really I find all of them galling, to be honest. And again, I respect the right of a president to do that. That's not what I'm talking about here. But what was particularly galling was Steve Linick at State. Now, the interesting thing with Steve Linick, who's a former federal prosecutor, was highly effective, but he got tomatoes thrown at him all day long for months and years prior, because he was investigating Senator Hillary Clinton, or Secretary Hillary Clinton's email server. So he was getting just pummeled for that work. And then he got pummeled. He was looking at Secretary Pompeo's travel expenses with his wife. So he was getting criticized for that. And the public record, public accounting of this is Pompeo went to the White House and said, I no longer have confidence in Linick. He's undermining the agenda. Yeah, he may be undermining your agenda. He's looking at fraud and misconduct and unethical behavior. And that's his mission. That's his mandate. And so there was no pretense of like, let's try to identify a semi-legitimate reason, or let's not even give a reason why we're firing. They don't have to give a reason why they're firing you.
So it sounds kind of like the crook firing the cop that's investigating him.
That's exactly what it felt like at the time. And it was,
and I remember, Bob, if I'm remembering accurately, Pompeo tried to sort of brush this off by saying, no, that was the president's decision to get rid of the inspector general that was investigating me. And then Donald Trump, who seems to only open his mouth to change feet, said very publicly, me? No, Pompeo wanted me to get rid of him. It was an absolute clown show, but it kind of struck at the very core of governmental oversight, of the folks who were in place to be a guardrail against fraud, waste, abuse, corruption. And it sure felt like, and this is not coming from a place of politics, it sure felt like the folks who were in positions of power making these decisions were doing nothing other than trying to save their own skin.
Yeah. And Glenn, I do want to mention another one. So you have that example, right, of Steve Linick at State, which you can argue he was fired in an effort to thwart his investigative authority. And then you have the first one that happened that people really forget because of all the surrounding circumstances. But Michael Atkinson of he was the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, and in April, and
a former federal prosecutor colleague of mine at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office. I know Michael.
And Michael was a phenomenal IG, unassuming, professional, did his job, worked in the intelligence community, so you didn't really see a lot of what he did, but he was absolutely, if there's anybody by the book, it was that guy. And I think a lot of your listeners will remember, in the summer of 2019, it's on a phone call with the Ukraine. At then was the new Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump said, "I'd like you to do us a favor, though." That went into the record. A whistleblower came to Michael Atkinson to say there was some potentially nefarious conduct in this phone call with the new Ukrainian president and our president. And Michael Atkinson had no alternative. Under the law, his obligation is to report that to Congress, who ultimately have the responsibility of oversight over the executive branch. Michael reported that, and we know what happened. That launched the first impeachment. And who paid the price for that? Really, only one person. Well, the American people paid the price for that. But personally, Michael Atkinson paid the price because the president fired him for his lawfully reporting and doing his duty, reporting that to Congress.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, but the whistleblower was Colonel Alexander Vindman.
Indeed.
He also paid the price dearly.
Indeed, he did.
It makes my blood boil. It literally makes my blood pressure rise, having spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor, both military and civilian, to see this kind of just abject corruption and abuse.
Yep.
Can you first talk about the incredible importance of inspectors general in our federal government, and then we'll transition to your time as executive director of the PRAC.
I'm a little biased because I've done it for 28 years, but I believe short of federal judges, I think the federal inspector generals are one of the most critical functions or offices in our system of government. No other country in the world has a system like ours with our inspector generals, although we borrowed it from the French. We've expanded the concept greatly, and now other countries are following our lead. It's critical because the IG, once appointed, in theory, notwithstanding what we just talked about, cannot be removed for reporting bad news. That's what you want. You want somebody that can come and report bad news. And with our election cycles, IGs transcend politics and they transcend elections. So you're the institutional knowledge for the agency. So when a new secretary comes in, the really good ones, the really smart ones, come in and with their senior leadership team, they don't want to hear just what the politicals are telling them, because those politicals are going to tell you what you want to hear. You want somebody that's the truth teller, that comes in to say, listen, I know this is your baby and I know you think it's working well, but let me tell you, here's the history on this and here are some risks that you're facing. A good secretary will respect and honor that feedback, but it's their professional judgment whether they take it or not. But that's the role of the IG. The role of the IG is, over the history of IGs, they've taken out, in terms of identified misconduct by sitting secretaries and had them removed from their positions. They've had some massive criminal investigations, usually fraud, but not always fraud. There's some of the stuff involves personal crimes, like Health and Human Services IG does child sex abuse in Indian country, which is just a horrific problem that we face, and there's not enough resources out there, but HHS-OIG investigates that. But of the 75 IGs, and there's usually one in the major agencies and departments and government corporations, and you're the watchdog. You're the eyes and ears for Congress and the American people. You're the one, because you are not supposed to be, you're not going to get fired. You're not going to be removed at the end of an administration. You can tell the truth, and you tell the truth in public audit reports, which are critical, and investigations and other types of oversight reports. It doesn't have to be just audits or criminal investigations. There's the whole range between those two disciplines. And so that's sort of my sweet spot, is operating in that range. It's like, yeah, we can do criminal investigation here. We can do a full-blown audit that can take 2 years here. But can we give insights to Congress and the American people now?